Do you have any anxiety that you feel might be holding you back? In fact, anxiety is like a forge that you can use to shape yourself according to your highest ideals. In this episode, we show you how to find the challenge at the root of your anxiety and engage it as a unique opportunity. I'm Sharif Yunus with Dr. Kevin Majors, and this is The Golden Hour. Understanding and engaging anxiety fits into our larger theory of growth. To get the complete picture, check out our 4-week online masterclass available on OptimalWork.com. In it, Dr. Majors will guide you through all the key ideas of optimal work, with exercises provided to help you master them. Now let's get started. Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of The Golden Hour, joined by Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, great to be back with you.
Hey, Sharif, great to be back again. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Kevin. Well, I know that you really specialize in helping people with anxiety, and it's something that we come back to from time to time. But I thought we've gotten a couple new inquiries and new angles on anxiety, so I thought this would be a great topic for today's episode. What do you think about that?
I've been dreading that.
I know it makes you anxious, makes you worried.
Yes.
Don't worry. Just channel the adrenaline into excitement.
Exactly. My palms are sweating.
So, okay, let's kick this off with a question from one of our listeners. Okay, so let me read this question. First, this person says, "Thank you for your work on the podcast. It has been extremely beneficial to me and our organization." So that's always nice to hear. And then this person continues, "I'm reaching out today seeking advice. I've been in a major avoidance routine with public speaking for over a year now, and it is starting to negatively impact my life. The anxiety has grown broader and is very discouraging. I remember Dr. Major saying that in order to train your amygdala, it requires frequent, repeated exposure to the thing you're avoiding, even up to 3 times a day. Is that right, Kevin?"
I don't know where I said that. So, because I usually think of exposure exercises being done once a day at most. To actually do one, there's what's called a latency period where it's hard to get it back until the next day. But the idea of frequent exposures, and if you can find a way to engage it multiple times a day, that's definitely beneficial, that I could say.
Yeah. Yeah, and also I think we talk about it more broadly in the context of challenge. If you set a goal in a particular area, like overcoming distractions or being mindful, the more you can practice that frequently throughout the day, the more growth you'll see.
Exactly. If you're setting a challenge for yourself or like a weekly area you want to challenge yourself on, you have to be able to do something with it at least a few times a day, I think, to make real headway.
Yeah. So, okay, let's continue. The problem is that public speaking engagements only occur once or twice a quarter for me, not 3 times a day. I sought opportunities, but the infrequency of exposure has not improved my predicament and maybe even made it worse. Even Toastmasters, which is a public speaking club, is only once a week, with an actual speech occurring infrequently with the club. Do you have any creative ideas as to how I can get repeated exposure to being in front of people? I think one angle that we can take on this is just, keeping it specifically about how to, improve in public speaking and how to find more opportunities to get in front of people with this type of thing, which is a great angle. But I think we also want to broaden the question out to just talk about repetition and exposure, which we've already touched on a little bit. So, well, maybe we could just start with the public speaking component and then broaden it out a little bit to talk about anxiety and exposure and repetition generally.
Yeah, it's a great topic. I think when it comes to public speaking, you don't want adrenaline to get to 0. So there's no need to be doing repeated exposures, trying to get perfect extinction of the adrenaline response. You need adrenaline for public speaking. Really, in that case, what you need is a few times, maybe at most, of having learned in the moment of the speech to flip the adrenaline around so that rather than experiencing as weighing on you as a burden of anxiety, it becomes a propulsion forward. It becomes a fuel that now you're using allowing you to hit a certain performance goal in the speech. So I always think of, say, like a tenor who is nervous about an aria he has coming up and he has to hit a high note. Well, he wouldn't want to suppress his adrenaline because he needs the adrenaline to hit the high note. He should be thinking, the more adrenaline, the better. Let me just use it all and take it as energy, and then I'll really hit the high note with perfect clarity. So if you have a performance goal that is not related in any way to the anxiety going away or to how you feel in the moment or what thoughts you're having, but is in the work itself, aiming somehow to make that work better, I think that's the key. So with public speaking, you don't want the adrenaline to get to nil. You just want to get used to getting through that phase, of having high adrenaline and then reframing it as beneficial and then utilizing it as a fuel. I also tell people that there are two phases of getting over any fear. One is learning in the moment. It's called in vivo exposure, how to get through it. So say that you're afraid of heights. Well, one thing is learning when you're on a high place to welcome the sensations of anxiety and whatever thoughts may come and see it as part of the learning curve, part of the growth. And then you'll find that soon you won't have anxiety on balconies. But if you know that you're going to be at, say, some event where you're going to have to be in a high place at some balcony, can't imagine what that would be, but say that was coming up, and your anticipation of the event could still produce anxiety, even though now in the setting itself, you don't have anxiety. This happens with people who are just starting out teaching. That at first they might be nervous about having to give a class, but pretty soon they learn how to channel all of that, but they could still be nervous in the run up, like in the lead time going into the class. So there's usually two different phases. One is that people learn to get over their fear in the moment. And then the other is to get over the anticipatory anxiety. And that just takes a little bit longer. So every moment then, I tell them, when you notice yourself tempted to dread this thing coming up, it's like a habit you have of dreading it. That's the moment to rehearse flipping things around and welcoming adrenaline as a superpower.
Yeah. Okay. This gets to a question that I've had for some time now. It kind of impairs my understanding of everything, but I've been suppressing it for the longest time. So we talk about the habituation curves, and for those listeners who've done the masterclass or watched some of your other videos on YouTube, you can actually see them. I'll have to just describe them. That when you're embracing a challenge, initially your anxiety goes up and up and up to maybe even a 10. But then as it habituates, it goes down and down and down to maybe a 0. So this is like a 90-second process in some cases, that as you embrace the fear, it diminishes. So it's kind of one of these nice paradoxes that the way the fear goes away is by embracing it. But now you're saying maybe it doesn't always go to 0. So that's kind of what I want to home in on here is when you're like, does it always go to 0? Or does sometimes it doesn't go to 0? It goes to like a 3 because that's where it kind of should be. Like your body just knows that, for public speaking, I want adrenaline at a 4. So when I go through the habituation process, as it curves down, it levels off at a 4 instead of a 0. I mean, is that what's going on? I don't know. Could you explain that a little bit more?
One way of saying it is that what you end up with is the right level of adrenaline to perform at your best. Okay, so that's one way of thinking of it. Another way of thinking of it is that anxiety is simply adrenaline with a negative frame. And so the anxiety part does go away as the frame becomes more enduringly positive. And then the adrenaline is all that's left, but now used as excitement or as energy in the endeavor. So yes, in some ways, anxiety does go away as a bad thing. And so, but the being keyed up and tuned up, that I would notice, this is, pre-pandemic, but that if I was going to be giving a talk to a very large audience, that I wouldn't be anxious, quote unquote, before giving the talk, but I would be keyed up, and that could happen 1 or 2 days in advance. It doesn't really happen anymore. So, but that used to happen more. I think that there's just the mind getting things ready. So yeah, the anxiety doesn't, the anxiety gets transformed back into healthy adrenaline. But if the stakes are high and it matters to you, and particularly if there's some way of growing that you're really excited about attaining, then you want the adrenaline because it helps you stretch yourself and it helps you get there. And ultimately, that's what anxiety needs. It needs a challenge that you set for yourself to where there's now a purpose for the adrenaline. And then you can more stably reframe the adrenaline as precisely the thing that's going to propel you to get there.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, I should have brought that up earlier. It wasn't that big a deal. So, okay, now when it comes to public speaking, I have two suggestions for this person's comment, which maybe you can comment on how this fits in. One suggestion is that you can look for public speaking opportunities, but you can also look for smaller opportunities to do this kind of like performative speaking. So even if you're just having dinner with friends, you can launch into a kind of animated storytelling mode and tell us a longer story or a longer joke. And that's a great way of practicing this kind of like fully investing yourself in what you're saying, putting your emotions into it, your intonation, working all these aspects of it. And that's something that you can do every day, frequently every day. You can do it in any meal with coworkers. You just start telling a story and try to get their attention and try to get into it. So I remember you gave me that tip once, and that was more nerve-wracking when I was about to tell a joke to a group of people than maybe some of my public speaking performances. So that would be option one. I don't know if you've worked
I think
on that with people.
Yeah, and the act of in some way being vulnerable in front of a group, it's even harder with a small group than with a large group. So being more self-disclosing with under 10 people I think there's literature on this, that can actually be more nerve-wracking, than giving a talk in front of 100 people. So why is that? Well, maybe it's just because it's more real. And there's the eyes of each person there on you. It's just everything's more real when it's smaller scale. Because many times you're giving a talk to a bunch of people, you're really just giving a talk to a few people because there are certain anchors you have in the audience. You're not really, but when a smaller group, you're giving a talk to more. And it's more anchors than you would typically have. That'd just be one theory. But this is commonly noted by people that just being revealing in any way, even about not embarrassing things, but just like inconsequential things or little details of one's life, can leave people feel vulnerable, and that's a great practice.
Yeah, that's cool. And then the other thing, which is I think is related to the way that you do exposures, which is that if the person does not fully reframe, they never really overcome the anxiety. And I think that's totally true of public speaking, is that if you go into the public speaking without like a really, really a full bring it on mindset and mentality that I'm just going to give it my all right here, and like I'm going to tell jokes and I'm just going to be fully invested in it, fully invested in the message. But if you just kind of like go and, okay, I'm going to say what I'm going to say and that's it. And, it's not going to be too bad because I'm one of 4 people presenting and they'll probably forget about me afterwards anyway. Like if you go in with that mindset, you're not really doing the full exposure. And so you're not taking full advantage of the transformative power of the challenge, I think.
Yeah. And then you don't get the same victory bounce from it. So there's something about hedging where they'll be somewhat invested, but not totally invested. Oddly, that leads people to not even prepare as well as they could for the public speaking event. So they prepare good enough, which is really nerve-wracking. But if you really prepare and then you rehearse it, the experts say you should spend about half the amount of time rehearsing. Well, your total prep time should be half rehearsal and half writing when it comes to giving a speech of any kind. Well, that means that I don't think people who are anxious will rehearse ever. I mean, some do, but commonly the people who I work with in my practice, they avoid the whole thing, and then they kind of push their way through the experience itself. But maybe there is this thing where they were playing it safe in some way by not fully investing themselves in the whole process. But if you just like let it all out, you give your best effort, that's how your best effort gets better and better each time. But if you don't give your best effort in it, then it doesn't really get stretched, so it doesn't really grow.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. So, okay, Kevin, maybe now we could broaden the discussion out to be anxiety per se. So, in talking this question of if the original question raised was like, how do I deal with anxiety if I don't have frequent, repeated exposure? And I think that might be the case for some people if they're anxious about a kind of bigger picture life question. So maybe a high schooler who's anxious about the whole college application process, or a college student who's nervous about their first job, or someone in a job who's kind of generally anxious about their performance. But it's not like one specific thing coming up that they're anxious about. There's no real specific trigger. So how do you work anxiety if there's no obvious trigger for it?
Mm-hmm. This also happens a lot when people are anxious about world events. So I see this in my practice, people that can have panic attacks because of a war going on or political unrest of different types. So, which then seems strange, right? Like, how do you help someone when there's no exposure to be done and there's nothing for them to do? There's evil in the world. There's bad things that happen. And that causes them anxiety. I think that way of thinking of it may not be correct. It's perhaps not so much the case that there is some situation so broad that there's really nothing for them to do right now about it. There's a phenomenon that we see a lot called displacement. And what that means is that there is some anxiety someone is experiencing, or there's some anxiety in someone's life that is happening right now, that's being triggered, but in some ways it's being denied. They're denying it a hearing. And that could be for many different reasons. It might be that the person isn't really admitting to themselves how much something is weighing on them. Or it could be that there is such habitual avoidance of a certain topic that's hard for them to let themselves even think of it. But yet it's like the elephant in the room. Well, in those cases, then the anxiety can get displaced to other things. So if a person is really anxious about getting fired from his job, then it may show up in some other topic. It could be something, it could be kind of put onto a world screen. So that now they're really anxious about this. You have to see that kind of more global, free-floating situation, like broad situation anxiety, may just be the channel that anxiety is getting funneled into. That's rather than being the thing itself. So yes, that thing does make them anxious to some extent, but it also makes them anxious in a way that they find acceptable. And that they're able to then admit the anxiety, and it almost works like some kind of outflow tract for the built up tension that's been in them, and it all gets poured into something. You see this also, like another version of it, in people who have obsessive compulsive disorder, that no matter what makes them anxious, their OCD gets worse. So they experience everything as a worsening of OCD. But it might really be that there's a very real situation in their life that they're not addressing at all. And the worse it gets, the worse their OCD gets. And it's just that is how they experience anxiety now, is they just obsess about whatever the topic might be. They obsess about, the faucets not being turned completely off. But so you could do exposures to those faucets, but what you would find is if you're not really uncovering the main driver of it, you're not going to change the ultimate outcome or dynamic. So really the question is, in my mind, when I'm treating people, does this make sense? What is the thing that to me makes sense as a story that explains why they're so anxious? And if someone says it's not saying that everyone with global worries and anxieties is displacing it. I'm just saying it's a common thing that's seen. So at least it's worth asking the question, is there actually something in their life right now that they could be engaging, and that there's a challenge waiting for them that just and that's what the adrenaline is actually for.
Yeah. Okay. That's a very interesting take. So displacement, I mean, that sounds like common phenomenon. Is that something that is only relevant in these kind of like, I don't want to say extreme clinical, but I'm just going to say extreme clinical, these types of situations? Or is that something that to some degree is like, how would you apply that insight to just normal day-to-day situations? Are there applications of it?
I think that displacement may be the most ordinary way people experience emotion. So that, as you can ask yourself, and the listeners can ask themselves, when you're bothered by something, like let's say you get short-tempered or interiorly you just get exasperated by something. Is that really the thing bothering you usually? Or isn't it more the case that there was something else, and then it kind of sets the stage, and then the other little things are like a straw that breaks the camel's back, and then the person gets all frustrated. I think it's true for every emotion, that displacement is a powerful phenomenon. It even works in a strange way with addictions, that whenever there's a stress in people's lives, then they will reflexively go to the addiction, as the thing, and then the addiction gets worse. But you really have to address what is the underlying thing. That many times addictions are just escapes, which is just another kind of anxiety. So it's just that they're fleeing from the real life, and they're actually trying in some way to reduce their experience of a challenge, but they're using a drug or a behavior to do that. So again, it's displacement, though. It's the same physics, I think, of displacement, that they're not dealing with the real issue, and so they experience these other issues on the side.
Yeah. Okay. So that then the solution is get to root causes, uncover the root causes, which is always a kind of hidden challenge that's being avoided.
Yeah. And that might be the hardest thing to be sincere about, is what is the real challenge I'm facing right now? So no matter what it might seem to be, I have this anxiety issue, I have this, this craving or this anger, whatever the issues might seem to be, does it make sense that that's the real issue? Or are there other things in your life that you just don't know what to do with? There are challenges you don't know how to engage. Maybe for decades you haven't engaged it. Or maybe you've never really learned how to engage it. Clearly, if you were really good at dealing with that challenge, it would just bring out the best in you, and you would engage it, and you would grow. But that's what anxiety, that's what adrenaline is there for. It's there to help us invest ourselves totally in the challenge. Like you were saying with public speaking, you have to put yourself totally in it. Let the refrain be complete. And that's exactly the same in all these other things. It's the specific real challenge that you are now actively using to stretch yourself. That's what makes everything real. And then I think people find these other things tend to then, the displacement starts to wane. And then people find that, okay, now they're getting traction in life again.
Yeah, that's great. And then, so as a follow-up to this, we often make the distinction between quantity and quality challenges. So a quantity challenge being, I want to accomplish this amount of work or read this number of pages in this amount of time. So I'm kind of pushing the boundaries of one of those quantities, versus a quality challenge, which is, how can I do this in a new and better way? So, and now if challenge is kind of at the core of addressing challenge, it's at the core of addressing the anxiety. How do you, is there a difference in these types of challenges, like quantity challenges for anxiety versus quality?
Well, it makes me think of studies that have been done, showing the relationship of dopamine and anxiety and how these things work together. And that when people are in situations where there could be a big payoff of dopamine, they also have leading up to it much anxiety. So you could think of, like, if that tenor hits the high note really well, that would be a huge dopamine rush. Yeah, but there's also anxiety involved in it. But dopamine also helps to moderate and make positive the experience of anxiety. Well, just looking from that perspective, you want them to work together. If you're doing quantity challenges, which is like, I just want to, instead of I have so much to do, I'm trying to see how to, instead of reading these 40 pages in an hour, I'm going to read them in 45 minutes. And so the quantity challenges can be good for helping you to stay on task and to engage. And so you should stay engaged, because if you gave yourself 4 hours to read those pages, you might be wandering all over the place. But at some point, it becomes about just getting this thing done. And getting it done will give you a bit of dopamine, but outcomes don't really give you much dopamine. So, and even if the outcome is attaining some status, you get some promotion, you get a new job, you get into the school of your choice. Yeah, it lasts for a little while, but not that long. It wears off. So things that you can just get done are not a stable source of dopamine. And you can have a lot more than unregulated anxiety as you pursue them, because there's nothing counterbalancing it in the brain. There's one line of research that suggests that. But when you think of quality challenges, which is how can I do this task in a new and better way, with more mastery, with more of an ideal, with more order, intensity, with more patience, more understanding, more generosity, more love. So you think of those challenges. Well, those things will matter to us more deeply. They are not an outcome, but a whole trajectory of growth. And trajectories give you enduring dopamine. Because if you really value being a wise, generous, patient, loving person, whatever the ideal that most strikes you in that moment, you will get dopamine as you make steps of progress towards it. And if you can make those steps of progress within the midst of big challenges, it's even deeper. So bringing ideals into your biggest challenges you do that by using some quality challenge in it. So it's not enough that you might be, nervous about, some people have social anxiety. They're nervous about their upcoming dinner with some friends, and an outcome would be to simply have no anxiety while you're there. Well, that's not great, because you don't even have control over that outcome, or just getting through the meal, But if they were to think of some quality challenge, like even with my anxiety, I'm just going to try to be generous in giving my best attention and interest to the people that are with. Well, that is something that's beautiful. That is something more deeply motivating. And then in the moment, as they're doing it, they get more and more dopamine, which makes the entire experience better, and the learning even goes deeper. So the best thing we can do is find a way to challenge ourselves in the very thing that makes us anxious. But the challenge isn't getting rid of anxiety. The challenge is doing that better. And bringing in ideals and deeper motives of love and service into that challenge is the best way of doing that. And that's how we kind of forge our character. It's almost like the anxiety is the heat of the forge, but we need to be intentionally shaping it in the midst of that. So it's not just about cooling the thing off. It's about giving the thing the right forge shape in that moment of plasticity.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, that's a very beautiful and powerful note, I think, for us to end on.
I think so.
Because we're now out of time. But so we'll be back next week.
All right, Sharif. Thanks a lot for your questions.
Awesome. See you soon. Well, thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Don't forget to check out OptimWork.com for a set of online tools to help you engage challenge in your life. See you next week.